Newsfirst, face to face with Charlotte Benedict.
Hello there, a very good evening and welcome to another edition of Face to Face. Revival of the economy, that is what everybody is interested in. That is what the people are looking for. That's what the people want, amidst, of course, several other things. But reviving Sri Lanka's economy that is in tatters is one of the main concerns of the general public of Sri Lanka, and so should be among the leaders of Sri Lanka as well. To put a little bit of context into all of this, the World Bank has issued a report that says over 29%, 29.3% to be exact, of Sri Lankans have been living below the poverty line back in the year 2023. And, well, by the way things are going, the situation is only going to get worse. But that can only be prevented if proper steps are taken, if proper legislation is passed, and if proper regulations are adhered to revive Sri Lanka's economy. Now, to discuss these matters and much more, we have with us today former Finance Minister Ravi Karunanayake. A very good evening, Mr. Karunanayake, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, sir.
Before we get into all of this discussion now, while we speak about reviving Sri Lanka's economy, let's take something that happened, you know, very recently, as far recent as today. Today, the Banking Amendment Bill was being debated in Parliament. Now, this bill is going to introduce changes to the banking sector of Sri Lanka, and of course, maintaining the stability of the banking sector here in Sri Lanka is of paramount importance if we are looking at economic recovery. But unfortunately, there wasn't a proper debate on this. Now, I say this not because debaters did not bring proper arguments in Parliament, not because any of that. There was absolutely no proper debate in Parliament because the scheduled speakers in Parliament weren't present. There were about 20 to 25 speakers who have been allotted times to present their views in Parliament with regard to these seriously crucial amendments, but it seems as if none of them were interested enough to even attend Parliament, and because of that, Parliament had to be adjourned for several hours. The debate that started thereafter was more providing excuses for why they weren't there. At the end of the day, there was no proper debate on the bill. There was no vote. The bill was passed. So, in your honest opinion, do you think that the current parliamentarians are actually interested in reviving Sri Lanka's economy?
Thank you, Charlotte, for giving me this opportunity. I would approach that question that you posed to me by, instead of referring to who didn't come and all, is just the lack of will and the inability to have a spine to call a spade a spade. Because it was the central bank thing that was being debated, and it was a contentious issue. Instead of grappling the problem, I guess the easy way was to be avoiding it, so that you don't need to take a stand, which was told to them before. Independence of the central bank would lead to such things. And at that time, nobody listened to this. See, the same lot, I mean, really, these type of things are more the opposition to run through this, because they're the ones who oppose certain things that are there. That's the general parliamentary tradition. You basically have a situation where you have got to tell certain things which are unpalatable, but it has to be done. Now, that is where I see avoidance, instead of taking the matter on, was the easy way out. And I mean, that reflects the same thing when the country went into bankruptcy 24 months ago. And now the writing on the wall was there, but nobody had the ability to forecast saying this was going to happen. It was only the one solitary member, Ranil Wickremesinghe, that was able to say so.
But on that point, I believe back in the year 2020, Dr. Harsha De Silva also raised this concern and said, you know, we need to go to the IMF. If not, we are going to face a serious issue. And I believe by that time, current President Ranil Wickremesinghe wasn't even in Parliament.
No, he was there.
Did he?
Well, he was the
late.
one who stirred the scene by saying that there's a necessity to go into the IMF because the reading. Because remember, we were the only party, that's UMP in 20, when we went into the election, that we said that we require roughly $7 billion to overcome the problem, because with the reduction of the VAT from 15 to 7.5 or 8%, you had an erosion of revenue of about 700 billion. So that revenue reduction was inevitably going to impact on the income and the expenditure. So when that was there with the COVID, it was obvious to anybody that you're going to have a cash crunch and a foreign exchange crunch.
Okay.
And that's the time which was basically mentioned that IMF is a necessity. Not that at that, before they went into bankruptcy. Now, the issue that came about was the opposition was unable to read the writing on the wall. Because when you know that such a thing is happening, your obvious revenues are dropping, your foreign exchange is not coming in, and you've got to take some contingencies, and no action was taken at that time. And it was the same opposition that was there at that time. So I'm only basically saying, but also, Shalan, I see a severe degradation in the parliamentary system.
Okay.
That is a lack of can-do people, ability with foresight, lack of educational qualification, all of them lead to such erosion or degradation in the parliamentary system.
So do you think that members of parliament really, or at least let's just say a majority of members in parliament really understand, know, or even go through these pieces of legislation that they pass that govern all of us?
I must say that they do spend some time, but you can't expect everybody to understand everything. That's being fair. Because it's the will of the people that elect them there. So thereafter, certain matters that are engrossed in the matters that are there with certain professionals, they must be able to study and respond on issues that are pertaining to that.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there is no proper action being taken.
So
a lack of, I would say, lack of will, or a lack of, I would say, I would basically put it, lack of interest.
Okay. So moving forward, of course, the general public will get an opportunity to elect the head of state and also a new parliament here in Sri Lanka to try and fix this current mess that we're in. So it's only fair that all contenders, all political parties are given a fair opportunity to make their case to the general public. Now, one thing is for sure, that all political parties in Sri Lanka have a dark past. As to how dark it depends really on the perspective of of the person looking at it. But besides all of those dark pasts, Mr. Karunanayake, speaking about the revival of Sri Lanka's economy, we speak about managing our expenses and income. There are a lot of technical matters also being discussed, but to kind of take a broad approach to this, one issue that Sri Lanka is facing is so much of red tape, so much of bureaucracy. In a foreign country, if I wanted to start a business, if I am a person without any legal knowledge, without any contacts, I could go to the department that manages whichever area of business I'm interested in and get advice from there, fill a simple form, submit it, pay whatever dues, and start my business. But it's not the same in Sri Lanka. So how does the UNP plan on fixing this if elected to power?
Well, Shalan, we have been, being a very modernized party, as you would know, we have always been about 15, 20 years ahead of time. And we pay the price for that as well. The reason being is when you see something that is there operating in other countries, the laggards from this end say that that is trying to take you to a place that never exists. And as a result, you get hammered either looking at from a different connotation, and we have gone through that. Remember, we are the ones who brought in the accelerated Mahavali system. We are the ones who brought the education. We brought in the computers to this country. We brought the TVs to this country. We brought, I mean, you name it, education system, university systems that are there. We brought in many modernized approaches. Even when you look at the trade, even 24/7 operating of supermarkets. All of them were things that should happen some way or the other. But when we bring it in advance, it's looked at and it's taken to task, saying that are impractical things that are there. So when you ask the question, we were the ones who basically made a paperless economy that was there. Asikuda system was something we brought in. But the resistance that come in with the government servants, you quite rightly mentioned at the start, the bureaucratic lethargy. And I would say that is bureaucratic terrorism, I would put. Because the general attack of the people, the media, is on 9,500 politicians. That is the president, parliamentarians, 457 provincial councillors and 8,600 local councillors.
But now you can cut off the provincial councils and the local government.
That's the total. I'm talking 9,500 as a total lot of politicians against 1.7 million government servants.
But now we speak of a bloated public service, and of course it's quite evident.
When you say bloat, you look at Singapore, which is roughly 300 to 1. We have 13 to 1. So you could see how bloated it is. So for every 13 people, we have one government servant.
Exactly. So who is responsible for the bloating of the state sector service? I mean, not to point fingers or anything, but all political parties do recruit constituents as part of their election promises. There was also, I distinctly remember, an election promise from Ranil Wickremesinghe during his campaign for, I believe, the presidency or the general election. I'm not exactly sure when, but promising 500,000 job opportunities.
No, not Sri Lanka. We said private sector. Because we are quite conscious of it, Sharon. Now, in 2001, when we inherited a negative economy, and when we came in, we were the ones who reduced the government service from 1.3 to 1.1.
Okay.
But we were summarily dismissed in 2004.
Okay.
Likewise, the saving is added on, and you say, here we created. Then you bloat it to 1.7 billion. Now, 1.7 million government servants is the impact today that you're roughly carrying in 2021, 84% of your revenue was paid for government service.
Pensions and salaries.
Pensions and salaries, quite right. So, when you look at your total revenue, being at that time, to my reckoning, was 1.6 billion, 1.4 trillion, went on for government servants and pensions. So what are we talking of? The entire payments that come in from the taxpayers go into service, unproductive government service. So you have got to cut this lethargy. And we were one party right along, not with disrespect, but just seeing what the writing on the wall is. You can't afford to have 1.6 trillion paid when you should be having not more than 700 billion being paid for salaries and pensions. Then you can use that 900 billion into capital expenditure. When you say revival of the economy, that is it. It is not revival of the economy, it is subsidizing every corner and also looking at having a bloated government service is the revival of the economy. Your revival of the economy is to ensure that you have productivity that is going on. You have got to export yourself out of this debt mess that we are in. We are today caught up with the lack of dollars coming in. More than that, you're caught up with the inability to pay your loans that have been taken. Now, loans being taken, if you have a revenue that is greater than the cost of capital, then it doesn't make a big difference. But if your cost of capital is 10% and your revenues are 1%, that is the problem. So these are areas that has to be action in order to get a revival of this economy. Words just simply making it rhetoric or just simplistically telling just to ensure that you reduce the cost is not the answer. You've got to walk that talk. You've got to basically show that you mean what you say. So that's where the revival of the economy is. And you gave opening on the basis of saying this is the government service that is bloated. I would basically say it is more than that, it is the unproductiveness of that. And also they also are looking forward today to get a golden handshake and ensure that they can go to the private sector if they like and ensure that they are also putting their best effort in a manner that is country developing. Because at the moment they know they come to work for 3-4 hours and they go back without putting anything into the system. So I would say that is the way forward for this country. We are taxing our people well beyond his means. And I don't think that you can tax any further. Now you've got to look at ensuring reducing government spending. Now, government spending would necessarily mean reducing the government service to a more productive-oriented situation. Look at the interest costs that are coming down. Now, we are having 4 to 5% statutory rate that is there in the central bank rate.
But that's not reflected in the banks.
Absolutely not. 16 to 17% your lending rate. So where does it? You can't go on this. I use the word stupidity of trying to contain money supply, trying to have an anti-inflationary approach, because you're immediately going to a contraction of the economy. So when you contract the economy and you're basically coming out of you're going to bankruptcy, you are having double trouble. So this is the reason why I've always been advocating that you have got to have the supply side being increased. You create. Remember, Jaya Jayawardena, when we came in, we had Mahavali, you had housing, you had Mahapola, things that were on. All this created employment creation to the country. That is the supply side management. So you basically ensure that you create that. Then, as I said, to overcome the problem, you have to export yourself out of the problem. Any rubbish to be exported means getting that dollar in. Market access, that's why once again you ask, how does the UMP look at it? We have market access as the way forward. 22 million is insufficient for critical mass. Then you look at ensuring that in order to have productivity, have efficiency and a cost per unit reducing, you increase your exports. Increase your exports, reduce your cost per unit. That's the way to go forward. So my remedy to this is ensuring that you create that bubble and ensure you come out of it in that manner.
But we know that there is geopolitics in play, and because of the situation that we ourselves created here in Sri Lanka, we are now, well, to a certain degree, stuck with the IMF program. The IMF program, of course, is envisioned or is created to alleviate Sri Lanka's economy, but we all know how geopolitics play in all of this. So moving forward with that, now you said one of the main ways on increasing, or one of the main ways of coming out of this crisis is to increase the supply of money, of course, to allow people.
No, supply side. My supply side, you're right to say though, but what I basically say, creation of credit in order to increase manufacturing.
Exactly. So the current situation is there is no conducive environment for increase or creation of credit. People are already drowning in debt. Before the suspension of the Parate law, banks were going after properties of people, houses even of businessmen, and summarily just auctioning those properties off for whatever prices.
That was done by the banks, and that was stopped by the government. And I respect, even if sometimes, even when we were trying to get this corrected, the banks are overprotected by the central bank. No, central bank thinks that they are holier than thou. But remember, 3-4 banks, finance companies crashed. Who are running that? The central bank. That's why I have no malice at all.
So at a time now,
yes,
when the IMF program has dictated that Sri Lanka should have an independent central bank, and now we do. And banks and the standing interest rates have been lowered to single digits, but the bank interest rates...
Remember, the single-digit reduction is basically an anti-inflationary approach.
Okay.
So, if you cut down everything, obviously it will come down to single-digit. But you need to have the economy moving also, and then have it at a single-digit. That's what you call a real central bank.
What can public representatives do to steer the country in that course? Or are we already too far gone because of central bank independence?
There's nothing gone too far, nothing that cannot be retracted. I was one person who was mentioning over-independence on an independent central bank does not help the cause. Now, in this extent, you don't have the secretary to the treasury in that monetary board. So how on earth does the government relay its economic policy to the central bank?
But hasn't that always been the problem with governments in Sri Lanka? The moment you give them some sort of approach to the central bank, be it to any other independent institution, say for example even the Independent Elections Commission, the moment you give them some sort of approach, they begin to completely bulldoze all barriers and completely abuse it, because In the United States, there is a strict separation of powers, but of course here in Sri Lanka, institutions tend to...
I'm sorry to say that. You don't have a strict... They are the Federal Reserve, basically actions on what the government line of action is. You basically have...
So are you saying now with the central bank becoming independent, there is absolutely no way for the government to, well, implement their vision for Sri Lanka as far as the monetary aspect of the country goes?
Don't get me wrong to that extent. My saying is that the independence that gave them, the first thing they did was to ensure that they bring in 240 billion a month expenditure on their salaries. Now, in a time when you are telling the rest of the country, please don't have salary increases because we can't afford it, you are basically telling central bank, no, do what I say but don't do what I do. So I'm saying I basically affected person because I have called a spade a spade.
Okay.
And sometimes that they basically didn't see in these so-called professionals that exist in this 1,100 in the central bank. And I don't believe that. As I said, the banks have gone under, the commercial banks have gone under. If that is the case, what is the central bank's authority? Because they were relatively independent even before, right? So on that score, we need to revive ourselves.
But the head of the central bank at the time was, of course, a politician. Former Governor Ajit Niwad Cabral.
Well, I won't bring any individual in here because I feel if they're here, I'll take any and everybody on.
Okay.
But I am basically saying it should basically a structure should be economically driven. So my frank feeling is without a central bank of this nature, this country will do better. I'm telling you.
So since you brought up this...
But of course, I basically paraphrase by saying one thing. The running of that political element should be professionally driven. You cannot have somebody that suddenly gets up and
When was the last time in Sri Lanka that we had professionally driven politicians?
Well, I believe from 2015 to 2017 was something which we increased revenues 45% without any impact. We had our revenues met with expenditure. And I must say, otherwise the bankers this thing won't give us the Asia's best finance minister, if not the case. But I'm trying to say, not that it cannot be done. Whether there's a will to do is the question. Now, President Wickremesinghe has a tough time, but he's certainly having financial discipline and carrying that message across. Right? So, at the moment, the monetary policy and the fiscal both seem to be run by the central bank, which is, I would say, is a healthy situation. But I guess with present times. So, I would basically say the revival of this is look at the supply side. And
when you say supply side, you mean production? Production.
When you mentioned most of the companies and debt. Okay, interest rates down, ensure that you give them more, because this central bank gives the umbrella when it is where the sun is shining, and you withdraw it no sooner than the drizzle on. Now, that's not what is expected of the economy. It's the small and the medium are crushed.
Exactly.
Remember, Shalan, it is not these innocent small and medium or the businessmen that basically went into bankruptcy. It was the central bank on April, maybe 4 years ago, that said that we'll go into bankruptcy in less than 3 days. Hard landing, soft landing doesn't make any difference. But the decision was taken. So on that score, you suddenly have your businesses that are running at 10 to 11% is called upon to pay 30%. How on earth can anybody survive? They're strangulating a person. So then,
what kind of a say do you think the government really has in all of these important financial decisions that at the end of the day really boil down to whether Sri Lanka will succeed or not?
Well, I would basically say just because IMF says doesn't mean that they're holier than thou as well. You have got...
Look at what happened in Greece.
Not only that, the IMF is a necessity when you go into bankruptcy or if you want to have financial discipline. Now, that is where we basically miss both opportunities. When we wanted financial discipline, then government thought best not. Certain factors for that as well. Then you go into bankruptcy, there's no other way except using IMF. But coming on to IMF doesn't mean they will have to do this and also jump to their tune as well. Must stand on your own feet and say this is the case. But Shalan, that makes life difficult when you are trying to come out of it. So you try to give as much as possible to get it. But thereafter, it should not be dictated. That's why you have this battle saying whether that train can take place, this train. Nobody can change this except using it more flexibly in order to ensure that is done.
So it's a constant negotiation come every quarterly or annual review.
The 16th IMF program was done by, I was the finance minister then. We certainly ensured that we told them, I'm sorry, these are the areas that our government would like, because the present president was the prime minister then, and he gave all the necessary assistance in doing so, and said, this is the way. And we got the revenue, and we showed them, here is the revenue without you telling us what to do. Now, pay is, I would say, he is absolute nonsensical. Getting 36% off on 100,000. You are virtually killing the young urban puppies. I mean,
6% on 100,000.
Yes. I mean,
the high brackets, of course.
I would say the same thing can be done, moving to about 200, 225,000 and collecting at the top end. I mean, top end, you can't afford to basically say, you will have to charge somewhere. You're getting 134 to 140 billion. Now, the same thing can be shifted and get higher at the top end rather at the bottom end. So you are making people able to live rather than tax them and make them paupers again. But that is the young urban professionals that are wanting to make a tomorrow of today. So I would say that's the best way to encourage them.
But of course, all these plans are amazing when you speak about it. But Sri Lanka has always failed when it came to implementation. So what do you think of that?
You're right, Shalan. I mean, I would completely accept what you say. It's not that you can't. Consistency in doing so is the problem. Because sometimes, as I said, the political play takes over from the professional approach, where you become like a janitorial service. If now economy in 2001, it was bankrupt, right? We came, revived it, but the revival was painful. That painfulness basically says, here it is, see not the way to go for, because somebody says something completely different. You come out of it and you make a success story of that, and back again, you basically hand it over to a lot that promises everything from nothing. Finally, you go into bankruptcy, and the same story that was told again has to be reopened. So you got to go to the second phase of pain. And then when you are ready to get out of that one, somebody will come and sell sunshine stories again. Now, it is very interesting to say, I want to give this, that and the other, without telling me how you're going to get that revenue. That's why UMP has been always a party that is to say, here is 100, and here is the 100 is earned by doing this. Now, when salary increase was given in 250, we ensured that we had 134 billion in order to pay that revenue. So instead of unnecessarily burdening, because then only you are creating inflationary tendency. So this is where we basically looked at the supply side in getting things done.
Well, of course.
Then just take another one on VAT. Now we earn, I think, 1.4 trillion, which is roughly, when you look at the 18%, that's roughly about 77 billion per percentage. But it could have been far better done in a more pluralistic manner. We could have got more and basically hadn't have a severe impact on certain.
Just one final question. We're in the final few minutes of the program. You spoke very strongly about reducing public expenditure. Let's take, for example, one simple incident, the Independence Day celebrations. The year that we went into bankruptcy, I think we spent about 92 million rupees. Then I believe just this year, as recent as this year, we spent over 100 million rupees. Is this absolutely necessary? Wouldn't it have been better if the decision-making body, in this case, of course, the president himself, would have, opted for a more charm ceremony instead of parading a majority of imported military equipment right across Galle face?
Well, I don't know what is the expenditure in it, but you're only asking Independence Day. Now, are you going to basically say we raise a white flag and say this is the end of this year, not said? That's why even if you are doing that, that is an expenditure that is localized, and I would say the cost is relatively low. Now, once again independent. If you looked at saying if it was a pageant that was there, then I could imagine. But when you say independence, I take it a different approach.
But of course,
I guess
there might be people who would differ with you
have empty pride, or we have proud nation. But that independence is something, if you didn't have it, they would have said, hey, you couldn't even have an Independence Day. This is the other side of the story. So I would say, my thing is, you can save, instead of 100 million, you reduce 1% of interest, you would have saved 2 billion, right? You look at, instead of the 16% that is there, you bring that by bring it down to the statutory rate reserve of 4% and have your treasury bills at 6 to 8% and ensure you basically save roughly about, I would say, 200 billion. Now, only thing you have got to do is the innocent elderly people that we then gave 15%.
Mr. Karunanayake, we're time's up. Thank you very much, Mr. Karunanayake. Of course,
I hope it has revived the economy.
Definitely. Of course, it's important to lead by example as well, and we will have to keep a constant eye on our leaders to see what kind of examples they set, because in a few months we will be given an opportunity to elect the leader that we want. We will be given an opportunity to elect our representatives to Parliament, and it's prime time that we got it right. At least now. Thank you very much for tuning in to another episode of Face to Face. Thank you very much, Mr. Karunanayake, for joining us. It's an end for today. Thank you very much. Take care and God bless.